When a humble, elderly woman boards a flight, no one could have expected the chain of events that would unfold. Laughed at by a flight attendant, dismissed by the passengers, the woman's true identity would shock everyone aboard. Moments later, what happened next would change the way we think about wealth, status, and humility forever. Eleanor Parker, a frail 76-year-old woman, stood out among the crowd, clad in a simple worn sweater, a modest skirt, and carrying a tattered suitcase. She shuffled slowly through the terminal, her tired eyes scanning the signs. Eleanor had led a humble life, and the sight of this elderly woman standing among businessmen, tourists, and families was a quiet reminder of the disparity in the world. As she approached the gate for her flight to New York, the crowd was already starting to board. Eleanor didn't mind the long wait. She had become used to waiting her turn in life. But what she didn't expect was what happened next. The flight attendant, Jessica, was standing near the gate, guiding passengers onto the plane with a polite smile. She looked over at Eleanor as she shuffled past, her gaze briefly scanning the calf elderly woman's simple attire. A subtle laugh escaped Jessica's lips, almost as if she was mocking the old woman. She quickly turned her attention to the next passenger, but Eleanor caught the look. Her heart sank, but she kept her head held high, not wanting to make a scene. She had learned long ago to endure, to ignore the judgments people made based on appearances. Eleanor was assigned to seat 1A, a first-class seat. The surprise on Jessica's face was hard to ignore. She watched as Eleanor slowly made her way down the aisle, her cane tapping against the floor with each step. The laugh Jessica had hidden earlier was now fully visible in her expression, a mix of confusion and amusement. What's a woman like her doing in first class? Jessica thought, shaking her head slightly. She doesn't belong here. But Eleanor continued on, her focus solely on finding her seat. When she finally settled into 1A, the luxury of the first-class cabin seemed to make the contrast even more stark. The soft leather seats, the fresh flowers, the crystal-clear glassware on the table. Yet here she was, this old woman with a frayed suitcase and a modest, weathered face. Eleanor smiled faintly, settling into her seat, feeling a sense of warmth and relief. But as the other first-class passengers settled in, Jessica's eyes never left her. Every now and then, she'd glance over, her thoughts more judgmental than before. How did she even get a first-class ticket? Jessica wondered, assuming. The woman must have been an anomaly, a mistake. But then, the flight began. As the plane took off and the seatbelt sign turned off, the captain's voice came over the intercom. His tone was warm and friendly, but it was the announcement that followed that would change everything. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a very special guest on board today, Mr. Daniel Pierce, a philanthropist and entrepreneur who's known for his work in supporting education and global health initiatives. Jessica's mind froze. She had heard the name before. Daniel Pierce was a billionaire, one of the wealthiest and most influential figures in the world. His name had been in the headlines countless times, associated with major charitable efforts and business ventures. But something about the way the captain spoke, as if this name was special, made Jessica realize just how important this person was. A moment later, as the captain's announcement ended, Eleanor, the elderly woman, stood up with grace, grabbed her tattered suitcase, and walked towards the front of the plane. Jessica's eyes widened in disbelief. The woman she had mocked moments ago was now heading directly toward the first-class cabin, toward the seat reserved for the most important passengers. Eleanor didn't just walk into the first-class cabin. She was the one the announcement had been about. Jessica's heart pounded as she watched the woman approach the area where the billionaire was supposed to sit. Could it be? Was she really Daniel Pierce? Had she somehow kept her true identity hidden all along? The flight attendants around Jessica didn't know what to do either. Eleanor approached the front of the cabin and without hesitation slipped into the VIP seat like she belonged there. The other passengers, too, were now watching in awe, unsure of what was happening. And then it dawned on Jessica. This elderly woman wasn't just an ordinary passenger. She was Daniel Pierce, the billionaire philanthropist, disguised as someone else. The realization hit Jessica hard, and she felt her face flush with embarrassment. She had judged Eleanor without knowing who she truly was. The woman who had been mocked, underestimated, and laughed at was no stranger to the powerful world of wealth and influence. She was not just any passenger. She was someone who had chosen to travel humbly, away from the glitz and glamour. As the realization hit Jessica, her mind raced with questions. The elderly woman who had been so unremarkably sitting in her seat was now, in fact, one of the wealthiest and most influential people in the world. She watched in stunned silence as Eleanor, or rather, Daniel Pierce, settled into her seat in first class. Jessica's heart sank, and she couldn't shake the feeling of embarrassment that washed over her. How could she have been so wrong? Meanwhile, the other passengers around her were starting to murmur among themselves, sensing that something significant was unfolding. It wasn't just the fact that Daniel Pierce had chosen to disguise himself as an elderly woman. It was the way he had been treated so humbly, as if he were just another ordinary passenger. The moment of shock settled in, and then the inevitable happened. One of the flight attendants, a bit more experienced than Jessica, walked up to Daniel's seat, ready to ask about any special requests. As the attendant leaned in, she paused, clearly recognizing the billionaire. "Mr. Pierce," she said softly, her tone filled with reverence. "It's an honor to have you on board." Eleanor, or Daniel, looked up at the flight attendant and smiled warmly. "Thank you," he said. His voice was kind, but firm, showing no trace of arrogance, only a quiet confidence. Jessica watched in awe as the entire demeanor of the cabin shifted. The flight attendants now treated Daniel with the utmost respect, offering him drinks and asking if he needed anything special. But what struck Jessica most was how Daniel had chosen to travel, how he had kept his identity hidden. He could have easily booked a private jet, enjoying the luxury of his wealth and status. Instead, he had chosen a simple, modest approach, sitting among the common passengers. Daniel's choice was baffling, yet inspiring. It was a statement, one that transcended wealth and status. He didn't need to flaunt his wealth to prove anything. He had chosen to live humbly, blending in with those around him, perhaps because he understood that respect and kindness came from within, not from the clothes you wore or the title you held. Jessica, still processing the situation, couldn't help but feel a deep sense of regret for her earlier judgment. She had assumed that Eleanor was just another elderly woman traveling on a budget, without realizing the extraordinary person she was truly dealing with. In that moment, Jessica understood something she had never considered before. True greatness wasn't about appearance or wealth. It was about humility, dignity, and how you treated others. As the flight continued, Jessica couldn't stop thinking about the lesson she had just learned from Daniel Pierce. The experience had humbled her in a way she never expected. The man she had dismissed as a simple, frail, elderly woman had just taught her a valuable lesson about judgment, humility, and the importance of not underestimating people based on their appearance. As the flight continued, Jessica couldn't shake the thoughts running through her mind. She had spent years working in customer service, thinking she understood people's needs, but here she was, completely wrong about someone who had just taught her a life-changing lesson. Daniel Pierce wasn't just another wealthy billionaire. He was a man who had chosen humility over vanity, simplicity over ostentation. This single act of kindness, this decision to blend in with the crowd, had left an indelible mark on Jessica. She stole glances at him throughout the flight, noticing how Daniel interacted with the crew. He was gracious, humble, never expecting special treatment, and always polite. There were no airs of superiority, no demanding gestures. He simply treated everyone with the same respect, whether they were a fellow passenger or a flight attendant. Jessica started to feel uncomfortable with her previous judgment. The truth was, she had assumed that his age, his appearance, and his modesty meant he was unimportant or insignificant, but now she saw how wrong she was. Daniel Pierce wasn't just wealthy in money, he was rich in character. As the flight neared its destination, the pilot's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to land in New York City. We'd like to take a moment to thank one of our passengers, Mr. Daniel Pierce, for his continued generosity and work in making the world a better place. He is, as always, an inspiration to us all." Jessica's face flushed as she realized the weight of the announcement. She wasn't the only one on the plane who had underestimated Daniel. Many had seen the elderly woman and assumed she was just an ordinary traveler. Now they knew the truth. Daniel Pierce had been traveling quietly among them, never seeking attention, never showing off his wealth. Yet, in the end, his actions had made a profound statement about kindness, respect, and the importance of staying grounded despite your status. When the plane finally landed and passengers began disembarking, Jessica watched as Daniel stood up, moving toward the door with quiet grace. He nodded to the flight attendants, who greeted him warmly, their respect for him clear. He didn't ask for anything special, nor did he try to make his departure dramatic. He was simply a man who had learned to live with humility, and he left the flight without any fanfare. but his impact on Jessica and everyone around him remained. As she watched him walk off the plane, she promised herself she would never make the same mistake again. She had judged someone by their appearance and had paid the price of her assumptions, but she had also gained something invaluable, a lesson in humility and the understanding that who you are on the inside far outweighs what you look like on the outside. Jessica would go on to tell her colleagues, her friends, and even her family about the elderly woman who was really Daniel Pierce. Her experience changed the way she treated every person she met. It wasn't just about how someone looked or the title they held. It was about how they treated others. Daniel Pierce had reminded her that greatness isn't about wealth, it's about character. As the days passed, Jessica couldn't stop thinking about Daniel Pierce. The encounter on the plane had changed her in a way she hadn't expected. She began to reflect on her own behavior, her own assumptions about people, and how easily she had been swayed by appearances. Daniel's quiet display of humility had taught her a lesson that would stay with her forever. She started treating everyone with more respect, not just the passengers in first class, but every person who boarded the plane, from the cleaners to the pilots. It wasn't just about customer service anymore. It was about creating a culture of kindness, where every person, no matter their background, was treated with dignity. She had seen the true power of treating people with kindness, and now she made it her mission to carry that into her everyday interactions. The ripple effect didn't stop there. Daniel's actions sparked conversations among the other flight attendants, who began to see their jobs through a new lens. They started talking more openly about their roles and how their treatment of passengers could impact their lives. The story of the elderly woman who wasn't just an ordinary passenger, but Daniel Pierce had become an inspiration for the entire crew. Passengers began to notice the change too. The next time they boarded the plane, they saw a different atmosphere among the staff. There was a warmth and friendliness that hadn't been there before, a subtle but profound shift that could only be traced back to one man's example of humility. It didn't matter how rich, famous, or powerful someone was. What mattered was how they treated others, and that lesson had changed everything. Jessica herself received messages from fellow flight attendants, and even passengers who had heard about the story and were touched by Daniel's humility. One passenger wrote to the airline, praising the crew for their exceptional service, mentioning how their kindness made them feel truly respected during their flight. The airline, recognizing the positive impact, started a campaign on kindness and humility, asking employees to share their own stories of how they had experienced or witnessed kindness. The story of Daniel Pierce, the elderly woman who wasn't who she seemed, had sparked a change in a small corner of the world. What started as a moment of embarrassment for Jessica had grown into something much bigger, a movement toward understanding, respect, and kindness. The passengers who had once silently judged Daniel had now become advocates for treating everyone with the respect they deserved, no matter who they were or where they came from. As for Jessica, she continued to work with a renewed sense of purpose. Every day she reminded herself that no one was truly ordinary, and that greatness could be found in the most unexpected places. She had learned from the best, a billionaire who, instead of boasting about his wealth and status, had shown her the true meaning of being rich in character. Weeks after the flight, the story of Daniel Pierce continued to make waves, not just in Jessica's life, but across the airline industry. What had started as a simple act of humility, an elderly woman who wasn't what she appeared to be, had turned into a lesson in humanity, kindness, and respect. Jessica, now more confident in her role, noticed a shift in how people treated each other. The crew started working together more harmoniously, not because they were asked to, but because they had witnessed something powerful. They had witnessed how one act of humility could change the atmosphere of an entire plane, and they were carrying that lesson with them every day. Passengers, too, had been moved by the story, even if they hadn't directly witnessed it. The next time they boarded, many of them approached Jessica with a new perspective. Some asked her about Daniel. Others shared how much they admired how the flight crew had treated everyone with equal respect. One man, a frequent flyer, even remarked how much of a difference it made in his day, simply being treated like a human being. As for Daniel Pierce, his name had become synonymous with not just philanthropy, but with a new kind of leadership, one that didn't rely on wealth or status, but on kindness and the ability to listen to others. He had never asked for the recognition, but it found him regardless, because when you lead with integrity, people take notice. One afternoon, months later, Jessica found herself in the airline's boardroom. The executives had gathered for a meeting to discuss a new company-wide initiative. a campaign focused on kindness, customer respect, and humility, inspired by none other than Daniel Pierce. It was clear now that the company had embraced the idea of leading by example, and Jessica was asked to share her experience. She spoke about the flight, the elderly woman who wasn't who she seemed, and how one man's humility had completely reshaped her understanding of what truly mattered in the world. The room listened, silent, as she explained the ripple effect Daniel's actions had created. The executives were moved, and within weeks, the airline had launched a nationwide campaign to promote kindness in the skies. The campaign didn't just stop at the airline. It spread to communities, workplaces, and schools as people began to share their own stories of kindness, humility, and treating others with respect, no matter their background. Daniel's story had ignited something far bigger than he could have ever imagined. It had created a movement that reminded people of the power of small, everyday acts of compassion. In the end, Daniel's quiet decision to travel with humility had done more than change the way Jessica and her colleagues viewed their work. It had sparked a cultural shift, a reminder that greatness is not defined by the size of your wealth, but by the way you treat others, especially those who can't offer you anything in return.